Today's daf we're going to be learning is Chullin, daf Kuf Yud Gimel. This month's learning is sponsored by Adam, Carolyn, Michal, Josh, Benny, Izzy, Gali, Shim, Zoe, Zaki, and Yehuda in loving memory of Fred Hochstetter, Ephraim ben Caleb Baruch, on his 18th year at site on Chet Elul. We continue to be inspired by his dedication to daily learning from the daf and beyond to its surrounding philosophical, historical, and legal nuances. We miss him greatly and can only strive to emulate his wise, kind, and elegant ways. With that, we're going to get started. We'll go back to the end of yesterday's daf, where we had a situation where they salted meat for Rav Mary Bar Rachel, and they salted the kosher meat that was slaughtered with the treifa meat. Okay, so these two meats were salted together, and they brought it before Rava. It came before Rava, and Amar le hatzmeim. Okay, so now, why did they bring it before Rava is a good question. In fact, Rashi gives one explanation of the Rashi, but disagrees. I'm going to stick only with Rashi just to keep things more clear, but know that the Rashba understands this differently because there are some issues with Rashi's commentary. But Rashi says that what's going on here is it was a vessel that was perforated, so the blood was dripping out, and as it was spitting out the blood, we already learned, it's busy spitting out the blood, it can't really absorb other blood. So that was really fine. But the issue was, what about the tzir? What about the brine or the juices from the meat itself that isn't blood? And then you have this kosher and non-kosher. And while it's busy spitting out the blood now we learned it can't absorb blood, but maybe Rashi says, the way he understands the question here, because the Gemara doesn't actually say what the question is maybe it could be absorbing some of what they call the tzir, which is the juices of the meat. And then it absorbed the treif meat, and that would make it a problem. Well, Amar Le, Rava said to him, Hatzmeim, lesor tziram v'rotvam v'kifa shelahem. So the Gemara says, Rava answers him, it says Hatzmeim by the sheretz. Now, why does it say the ha yidiyah, the tmeim? The tmeim comes to teach you that not only are shretzim, and this would apply to animals and all that as well, are forbidden, but also their tzir, their juices, their rotef, their gravy, and their kippah, which is that hard part that gets stuck, the crusty part on the bottom, also that is forbidden. Okay. Now, this doesn't exactly answer the question, and that's why Rashi's is a little bit tricky, because he wasn't saying, is the tzir forbidden? He was asking, is the tzir get absorbed? So what Rashi says is, he adds this, and it's not exactly the simple reading, and that's why the Rashi has a different pshat here, different reading of the text, but Rashi says, since the tzir, what he's basically saying is, while it's busy spitting out blood, it actually can absorb the tzir. Now, the problem with that is that that's not exactly what Rava said. Rava quoted hatzmeim, that's meim, which means the tzir is forbidden. Rashi takes one step farther and said what Rava must have been saying is, it's forbidden because it's also getting absorbed even while it's spitting out the blood. Okay, we have to accept that in Rashi, even though, again, like I said, the Rashi has a different explanation, but Rashi's explanation has some issues with the continuation of the Gemara. So we'll leave it with Rashi for today, and we'll explain it like that. To which the Gemara, starting at the beginning of our daf, says, V'lemale midishmuel. Why didn't Rava answer him that it's forbidden based on what Shmuel said? Ta'amar Shmuel, maliach hareu kirotech, v'kavush hareu k'mevushal. Shmuel says that when you're salting things, it's as if you're cooking it. Okay, and kavush, and pickling things as if it was cooked. Anyway, the point being, it's as if it was boiled. And if it's boiled, then flavors get transferred. And that would have explained that because it was being salted, the flavors got transferred, meaning the treifa tzir, the juice, went into the other meat. And why don't we just prove that? That would have answered the question. To which they say, what do you mean? Imi de Shmuel havamina hanemile damman, aval tziran verotban lo kamashmalan. Comes the Gemara and answers and says, if we just had Shmuel, you would have thought that maybe when we say maliach hareu kirotech, that helps with blood absorption. Salting things will make the blood as if it was cooked with the blood. Now this would have to be, you have to shift gears a little bit, because what did we say? Well, it's busy spitting out the blood, it's not absorbing the blood, and we talked about a perforated vessel. Now we're going to say that what they mean is, maliach hareu kirotech, when would that be the case? If the vessel wasn't perforated, and then while it sits in that blood that came out, it'll actually absorb the blood that came in. And that would be through salting, because again, if something's just sitting in something and it's cold, it's usually not an issue, but the salt makes it as if it was cooked, and that would be a problem. But in a similar situation, if it was brine or this juice of the meat, then you would think maybe not. Maybe that stuff wouldn't be transferred because maybe it's only the blood, that maybe that concept, and again, it's hard to understand this exactly, but why you would think this. But if you say, that might be only that salting specifically, and maybe there's a reason, because salting pulls out the blood. So maybe when we say salting is like cooking, it's only talking about the blood. And if you have this non-perforated vessel where it was then sitting in the blood, that had come out and it got absorbed by another piece of meat, that would be a problem. But the tzir and the rotev, maybe not. Maybe the gravy and the juice doesn't get transferred in that way. Kamash malan, that's why Rava had to bring that pasuk katzmeim to teach you. Also, the brine gets absorbed by the process of salting, and therefore the kosher meat that was salted with the non-kosher, the treif meat, that is basically going to be forbidden because of the juices of the non-kosher meat go into the kosher meat. Okay, and thus ends that section. But we're not completely done because we're going to have a meitive. We're going to have a difficulty on what we said. Now, Rava, we're basically going to have a difficulty with Rava. Rava says the brine is or the juices, we'll call it, is a problem. So meitive, dag tahor, and what do we say? Basically, because they were salted together, it's now forbidden. We had a kosher with a treif and salted together, and we're going to say the juices went from one, mixed in with the other, right? The juices from the treif went into the other, and it's forbidden. Well, let's look at this Tanaitic source. Dag tahor, we're going to have actually 3 parts of this Tanaitic source. We're going to go one by one, and we'll see how this sugya unfolds. There's a lot of 3s in today's sugya. We'll see them as we go on. Dag tahor shemachoim dag tamei mutab. So a kosher fish, very similar to what we just talked about, that was salted with a non-kosher fish. Now, salting by fish, I just want to point out, there's no issue with blood when we salt fish. Because, right, we had salting of fish before. It's not a blood issue because the blood of fish is not forbidden. That's why we don't have a problem, right? We don't have to kosher fish like that. But anyway, we're salting the fish, and obviously the issue here is going to be the juices come from one fish to the other. So it says here, dag torah shemachom dag tameh, that you salted with a non-kosher fish, mutar. So the kosher fish that was salted with the non-kosher fish is permitted. Now, my lav shayush nehem luchim. Now, don't we assume? Now, it doesn't say that they were both being salted. It said the dag tahor that was being salted with the dag tameh. So right now we're going to assume probably both were being salted, and then it's exactly like the case of Rava where he was salting kosher with non-kosher meat, and Rava said it was no good. This says it's permitted, so that seems to contradict what Rava said. To which the Gemara responds, "Lo, that's not the case." The kosher fish had salt on it, but the non-kosher fish didn't. And because it didn't have any salt on it, that wasn't being salted. It was just next to it. But the salt doesn't, the salt is what draws the blood out, the juices out, right? In this case, it's not blood, it's the juice. And that's why it wasn't a problem, because nothing got drawn out of the non-kosher fish. Okay, so that's a good answer. And we can say, because all it said was dag tahor shemachom dag tameh. The dag tahor was salted with the non-kosher fish. So you can assume maybe the non-kosher fish wasn't salted, and then it's not a contradiction. However, we're going to have a problem with this. Hamitikatani seifa. But the next section of that source says, and I'm specifically saying next and not end. Seifa is usually end, because soon we're going to have the seifa of the seifa, the end of the end, meaning the third part. Right now we're in the second part. Now, we tried to say the first part where it didn't specify which one was salted and which one wasn't. We assumed first glance they were both salted. Then we switched to say, oh no, maybe only the kosher one was salted, and that's why it wasn't a problem. But look at the next case of the Braita. But if the kosher one was salted and the non-kosher one was not salted, and then we're going to say it's permitted, but you can then assume if that's case number 2, then case number 1 can't be the same as case number 2. What's the point of saying the same case twice? So michalal dereisha b'shnehem eluchim askinan. So it sounds like the first part of that braita is both are salted, and then you have both are salted. It's okay, and if one is salted, if the kosher one is salted and the other one wasn't being salted, it's also okay. Anyway, that means the first one is actually going to contradict Rava now, because both are being salted and it's okay, as opposed to Rava, who said when it comes to the meat, it's not okay. So the way to resolve this is Perusha Kamefarish. No, you think case 1 and case 2 are different? No, it's actually one case. And the second line of the Braita comes to explain the first line. It's not that the first case is they're both salted, and the next case is one is salted and one isn't. No, and the kosher one is salted and the non-kosher one isn't. It's that both cases are one and the same. And the Perush Kamefarish is Tahor. The second line is coming to say, what did we mean when we said? And as we start with, as we would say in English, you put a colon, right? So we have dag tahor shemachom dag tameh. You have a kosher that was salted with a non-kosher. It's permitted. In what case is it permitted? If the kosher one was being salted and the non-kosher one wasn't. And so case 2 is really case 1. And then you can then explain that, but if, right? So we were going to read it like this. Tahor shemachom dag tameh mutar. When is that? Ketzad, in what case? Shayat tahor maliach v'tamei tafel. Okay, if the kosher one was salted and the non-kosher one wasn't, then it would all be permitted, as we're going to see later, that if it's flipped, it's not going to be permitted, because the non-kosher fish was salted and that got the flavor out into the kosher meat. Anyway, they're now going to further prove that case 2 is really case 1, and it's just explaining it. Hachinami mistabra. It makes sense to explain it that way, because the isa kadatach resha shnehem eluchim. If you said they were both salted, now let's try to read the Braita the way we originally thought. Both are salted, it's permitted, and if only one was salted, it's permitted. Now that doesn't make any sense to go like that, because hashash shnehem eluchim shari. If both are being salted and it's permitted, tahor maliach v'tamei tafel mibaya. Do you need to then go and say that if the kosher one was salted and the non-kosher one wasn't, it's also permitted? Of course, if both are salted, it's permitted. Then, of course, if only one was salted, it'll be permitted. So they say, okay, wait. Maybe case 2 really is coming to explain case 1, but your proof you just brought a minute ago doesn't hold. Why not? Im shumha lo iria tana seifa legalu iresha. If you're going to say that doesn't prove anything, because the seifa, the second case, could be coming to explain the first case. It really could be 2 separate cases. And you say, oh, it's not necessary? Well, I will tell you it's necessary, because delotema, don't think, reisha tohor maliach v'tamei tafel. When we only give one case, we don't know how to explain that case. Is it both are being salted, or is it only the kosher one's being salted and the non-kosher one isn't? So if you only have one case, you might have assumed, without any specification, that, which is what the first case is, it doesn't specify, you might have thought that that's only when tohor maliach and tamei tafel, when the kosher one's salted and the non-kosher one isn't. Aval shneim eluchim asur. But if 2 are being salted, it would actually be forbidden. And therefore, Tana Seifa Tor Maliach V'Tamei Tafel Michlal Dereisha Shneim Eluchim V'Afilu Hachi Shari. Well, what they're going to say in the end is it must be, again, this is all just to say your proof. Now, it might be true, but you tried to prove it and say, well, case 1 isn't necessary. Case 2 isn't necessary if you already have case 1. No, I'll tell you why it's necessary, because if we only have one case, you might have thought it was only the case when only the kosher meat was being salted and the non-kosher one wasn't. So we need 2 cases so that you know that the first case must have been both are being salted and the next case is only one is being salted. And then that will be a way to explain it, and then that, therefore, it's not clear that this is the way to read it. Okay, so that was just a rejection of the proof. But now, Tashma Seifa. So now it's inconclusive, to which they say, well, let's try to learn it from Seifa to Seifa. I told you we get to this, the end of the end, which basically means the third case there. Aval im, now what does it say there? It's going to be the reverse case. Aval im hayat tamei maliach v'tahor tafel. If the non-kosher one was being salted and the kosher one was not being salted, asul, that is forbidden, because the fish juice is going to come out and that's going to go into the kosher fish. Tamei maliach, now what can you infer from this? Tamei maliach v'tahor tafel huda asul. Well, it's only going to be forbidden when, now this is going to go back to what the question was that they asked Rava, because if the tamei maliach and tahor tafel, if the kosher one is not being salted, which means it's not busy spitting things out, and the tamei is maliach and the non-kosher one is being salted. So while it's being salted, right, it's spitting out juices, it's spitting out also the blood. The other one is not being salted, so it's not spitting out blood, but it's going to absorb, because the salted one that's getting out the blood and getting out the juices, right? Really, we're not talking about blood here, because we're talking about fish. So the issue is, right, the truth is then a minute ago what I said, that the fish isn't spitting out, but I guess the point is this fish isn't busy spitting anything out, so because of that it can absorb the brine, Anyway, what does that seem to imply? That in that case, it's forbidden. But what can you assume about both of them? Tamei maliach v'tor tafel huda asur. That's the case where it's forbidden. Hashnihem luchim shari. But if both were being salted, it would actually be permitted. Okay, because again, both are busy spitting out, they're not actually absorbing. And that would go against what Rava said. So now they say no, because I did Tana Reisha Tor Maliach v'Tamei Tafel, Tana Nemi Sefer Tamei Maliach v'Tor Tafel. Case 3 only goes into that detail as to which is being salted and which is not being salted, because it only said that case because it was trying to compare it to case 2. And case 2 is worded that way, and therefore case 3 is worded in the reverse. But it could be the same for both are salted, and both are salted could be forbidden as well. And that would then not be a difficulty against Rava anymore, and that would prove Rava. So in the end, we tried to bring difficulties against Rava, but in the end we resolved them. Or at least say there's a way to possibly resolve it, even though these sources aren't 100% clear cut, but they definitely can be explained not to be a difficulty against Rava. Okay, now we're going to have a siman. I told you we're going to do 3s today. There were 3 parts of that braita. Now the next 3 is the siman, bisra demanach nafkuta. Meat that was left goes out, which doesn't really have any meaning. But the point is, it's a way to remember these 3 statements of Shmuel. One to do with basar, one to do with it was left there, and one is to do with going out. It's not really a good way to remember, at least for me it wasn't so helpful. You'll see why. Okay, first statement of Shmuel. And from Shmuel we're going to get off on some other statements as well. Amar Shmuel, first statement. Ein habasal yotze midei damo, ela im kenu mocho yafeh yafeh umedicho yafeh yafeh. You're not going to get the blood out of meat unless you salt it really well and wash it really well. Now, what does yafeh yafeh mean? Very well, or it's double yafeh. Unclear. Okay, some of the commentaries say this means you have to rinse it twice and you have to salt it twice. Some people say no, it means you have to, or really the rinsing off is what they really talk about in terms of multiple times. Some people say you have to rinse it 3 times. The Or Zarua says that. There's different interpretations, and there's a lot of different halachic ramifications about this, how seriously you take this. But the point is, if you just take it simply, has to be salted very well and also rinsed very well. Okay? Because that's going to get out all the blood, and then once you get out the blood, you have to rinse it, because if the blood sits, you might have had the salt remove the blood, but then the blood's sitting on it, it's going to get reabsorbed. Itmar, Rav Huna Omer Molech Umediach, B'manita Tana Mediach U'Molech Umediach. Now we have this machloket, or it seems to be a machloket. In a minute we'll see it's not really, but Rav Huna says you salt and then you rinse. And in a braita it says you rinse, salt, and rinse. You rinse once before, once you salt it, and then you rinse after. V'lo pligi, hada chalalei beit habacha, hada lo chalalei beit habacha. It actually really depends whether they rinsed it in the butcher shop already, but they didn't rinse it in the butcher shop. If they rinse it in the butcher shop, then when you get it, all you need to do is salt it and rinse it. But if they didn't rinse it in the butcher shop, then you're going to have to do the rinse yourself. So it actually really is an irrelevant machloket because they both agree. Rav Dimi min hardea malachle b'milcha gdalalanita umenapitzle. This is a very interesting statement, and you'll see why. Because he did something, and there's a huge debate among the Rishonim what exactly he did and why he did what he did, and what we can learn from here again, halacha l'maaseh, what we're supposed to do. So Rav Dimi from Nehardea would salt it with coarse salt. Now this is why we call it kosher salt, because that's the salt we kosher with. But what's an interesting debate, he would salt it with kosher salt, and then he would shake it off. Now that didn't appear before. We saw rinse off. Here he would shake off the kosher salt before he rinsed it. So now the question is, why would he do this? And it sounds like he only did it specifically with coarse salt, but he wouldn't have done it with fine salt. Now, one of the comments, the Rashi here says, let's just go through. Rashi says, in other words, you have to brush off the salt because the blood gets absorbed in it. Now, why in the coarse salt and not the fine salt? It just melts on its own, so you don't actually have to take it off. So the blood gets caught in the coarse salt, and the coarse salt stays there, and that's why we have to make sure to brush it off first. So Rashi seems to be implying that if you do it with coarse salt, you actually have to add another step to the process. Some people take this in the opposite direction, and they say you can't use fine salt. Not that fine salt is easier. It's actually worse, because the fine salt stays there, kind of dissolves, but dissolves right there, and then the blood comes out and goes right back in. Whereas the coarse salt is much better, because the blood will be absorbed in the coarse salt. The coarse salt will stay separate, and then you brush it off, and then you rinse it, and that's the best way to kosher. So some people think based on this, we actually paskin like Rav Dimi, and that's the only way to do it. Some will say if that's the only way to do it, then what were people doing before Rav Dimi? And they think it could be done with fine salt as well. Okay, moving on to the next part. So Amar Rav Mesharshia, we're already talking about blood. He adds another point. This all, by the way, came from this first statement of Shmuel about the basar needs to be salted really well and rinsed really well, and then we got off on some tangents. So Amar, and soon we're going to get to the second statement of Shmuel. Amar Rav Mesharshia, Ein machzikim dam b'bnei me'ayim. There's no blood that gets collected in the intestines, so you don't have to worry. If it wasn't salted, you can eat those parts of the meat, even if they weren't salted. Tirgama, they explained, what do we mean by b'nei me'ayim, the innards? So akarkashta, umaya, v'hadra dechanta. So these are the rectum, the intestines, and the spiral colon. Okay, those are the three parts. Okay, second statement of Shmuel. Amar Shmuel, ein minichim basar maliach ela al gabei kli menukav. When you're salting meat, it has to be in a perforated vessel. Because if you leave it in a non-perforated vessel, what will happen? The blood will collect, and then the blood will get reabsorbed into the meat. We don't want that to happen. Rav Shesha, malach le garma garma. Rav Shesha was even more strict, and he would salt piece by piece separately, and not piece on top of another piece, because he was worried about the blood going out of one and into the other. To which the Gemara says, no, that doesn't make any sense. Trei my tamala, why wouldn't he put two together? Mishum deparish mehayu balahai. Well, we assume because exactly what I just said. It'll leave one and be absorbed into the other one. But if that's the case, then even one piece is problematic, because chanami parish mehai gisu balahai gisa. If you put salt on the top of the meat, what will happen? The blood will come out of one part of the meat, and then it'll get absorbed into the other part of the meat. And basically, you're going to end up with blood being absorbed by the same piece of meat that did it, right? That same piece of meat. So, elaloshna. We said it doesn't make any bit of a difference, and you can even put two pieces together, because if we're not worried about the blood going from one part of the meat to the other part, that same piece, then we're not worried about it going from one piece to another piece. Amar Shmuel, third statement of Shmuel. Mishum Rabbi Chia, he said this in the name of Rabbi Chia. Hashover mafrakta shel behema kodem shetetzeh nafsha. If you break the neck of the animal before it dies. Now what happens is, as it's dying, so it spurts the blood out. But if you break the neck, then it's going to stop the blood from spurting out. And what's going to happen to the blood? It's going to stay in the body of the animal, in the limbs that it's in. It's going to make the meat heavier because there's more blood inside it. It's not actually meat heavier, it's just heavy because of the blood. V'gozelet habriot, and you're basically stealing from other people, because now you're going to sell that meat for more money because you sell it by weight. And it weighs a lot more, but only because of the blood that's stuck in it. Umavli adam be'evalim, and it's causing the blood to be absorbed in the limbs. Now the question is, what's the problem here? So we buy Eluhu, and there's two different issues going on. There's going to be blood there, and because there's blood there, it's actually making the animal heavier, and you're stealing from you're basically going to cheat people. So we buy Eluhu. They ask the following question: Hechi ka'amar? How is this said? Machabir tabasar v'gozel tabriot mishum debavli adam be'evarim. Were we saying that this is going to make the animal heavier and cause you to steal because the blood is collected in the limbs? But haladide shapir dami. But if you want to eat it yourself, it's no problem. Because we don't care about the meat. The meat that's in the limbs is actually not a problem. That's option one. O dilma ladide nami asur. Or is it also forbidden to you because you're also stealing from people and you're causing the blood to be remaining in the limbs, and then people are going to eat. You're going to eat the blood, and it's a prohibition of the blood. To which the Gemara answers, take. We don't actually have an answer. Now, there's this concept that the blood in the Evarim is actually permitted, the blood that stays in the limbs. What we're concerned with is blood that came out of the limbs. And if this blood stays actually in the limbs, then perhaps it's not forbidden. And that's the question, really. So it does sound like the only issue here is gozel tabriot, you're stealing from other people, and you're cheating people. And then it doesn't seem like the blood itself is the issue, but the Gemara questions and isn't really sure. Okay, moving. So that was the third statement of Shmuel. Okay, so let's just review this section. We had this case of Rava. Rava permitted this meat that was salted kosher with non-kosher. We said, right, Rava answered that it's forbidden because of the juices. They said, why don't we just prove it from Shmuel with the Maliach Harei U'Kervatech? And we said that wouldn't prove that the juices are actually forbidden, and we need to know that the juices are actually forbidden, or again, that the juices get absorbed as well. Okay? Then we brought two difficulties from this three-pronged Braita, but resolve them, or at least have possible ways to resolve them. And then we move to these three statements of Shmuel, one being that you have to salt it really well and rinse it really well. And from there we got off to this thing about Reb Dimi, that he would salt in the coarse salt. And then and that there's certain parts of the body that we're not worried, the innards, that the blood there is not a problem at all. Second statement of Shmuel, you have to do it in a perforated vessel. And Rav Sheshet, who actually did all the pieces separate, but they said that's really not necessary. And Shmuel's last statement about breaking the neck of the animal, which would cause the blood to stay in the body, which would either only be a problem because you're cheating people because now the animal weighs more, or maybe it's also a problem of eating the blood and we weren't sure. Now we're going to move back to the next Mishnah, or to the next Mishnah, which really goes back to the beginning of the Masechet, or we were talking about putting the milk and meat on the table together. So if you put chicken with cheese on the table, there's no Torah prohibition about this. So now they say, it sounds like putting it on the table is not a problem, but eating it together would be a problem. And therefore they say, it sounds like you would transgress if you actually ate it. And that sounds like eating chicken, and cheese is prohibited by Torah law. And that would be against Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yossi Aglili, who thinks it's not. But the Gemara then says, no, if you put chicken and cheese on the table, you won't come to any Torah prohibition, because even if you ate them together, it wouldn't be a Torah prohibition, like Rabbi Akiva or Rabbi Yossi Aglili, who we're about to see their opinions in the next Mishnah, which we're going to start right now. So there's two ways to understand that Mishnah. Either it's going against Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yossi Aglili and actually saying that chicken is prohibited by Torah law to be eaten with meat, or you say, actually, no, it's even if it's not prohibited, this Mishnah could be saying that as well. It's not even prohibited by Torah law, and therefore there's obviously no problem to put it on the table together. Okay, new Mishnah. Basar behema, the order of these Mishnayot, I will point out, is a little bit tricky. Why? Okay, if you want to look back, you can look back at the Mishnayot. We kind of started with this topic in the beginning, and you would have expected to find this in the first Mishnah, where we said includes meat and chicken and fish, okay? But we didn't get to here till later, and it's unclear why the Mishnah went in this particular order, where it got into some other things and then comes back to this. So, basar behema Torah b'chalev behema Torah, asur levashel v'asur b'hana. So if you take kosher meat and you mix it with milk of kosher meat, it's forbidden to cook and forbidden to benefit from. Basar behema Torah b'chalev behema tme'ah. But if you take kosher meat with non-kosher milk, or basar behema tme'ah, or non-kosher meat with chalev behema Torah, with kosher milk. Okay, so either one of those is not kosher. Mutar levashel, mutar b'hana'ah. You can eat it. Okay, so you can cook it, and it's permitted to benefit from it. You obviously can't eat it; it's not kosher. Okay, but right, both the milk is not kosher, or the animal's not kosher. But it's permitted to cook it together, meaning there's no prohibition really, and there's no prohibition to sell it and get benefit from it. The only basar b'chalav that's asur is kosher meat with kosher milk. Rabbi Akiva Omer. Now we get into Rabbi Akiva. Chaya ve'of einam min haTorah. Okay, chaya and oaf, animals and chicken, are not by Torah law. They're not forbidden by the Torah law. Shenemar lo tfashel gedi b'chalev imo shalosh pa'amim. Now this is very famous. It says it 3 times. Now normally we learn what is Rabbi Yishmael, not Rabbi Akiva, which is one is asur b'hana'ah, to benefit, one is asur to cook, and let's start with one is telling you it's forbidden to cook them, one is telling you it's forbidden to eat them, and the third is telling you it's forbidden to benefit from. Okay, that's the way we usually learn this. This is not what we're learning yet. We're going to get to that on God. I think it's on Kuf Tefav. We're going to get to that. We're not there yet. So, Rabbi Akiva says, it says it 3 times. What do we learn from there? So, prat l'chaya u'la'of u'l'be'emat be'at. It's to exclude, number 1, No chayot are included. Undomesticated animals are not prohibited. Birds, chicken, not prohibited. And the third is non-kosher animals are not prohibited. Okay, it's coming to exclude 3 things. Rabbi Yossi HaGlili Omer, Ne'amar lo tochlu kol nevela. It says, don't eat any nevela. V'ne'amar lo tfashel gdi b'chalev imo. And it also says, right, in the same pasuk, okay, you have to get the pasukim, but in the same pasuk it says, okay, I'll read you the whole pasuk because we're going to see this over the next few days. Lo tochlu kol nevela, l'ger asher b'sharecha titnena. Don't eat any nevela. Give it to the ger in your sharecha, in your gates. Titnena, give it to them. Va'achala. This doesn't mean a convert. This means a person living who's keeping the 7 Noachide laws, or living in the land and keeping basic mitzvot. O machor l'nochui, or sell it to a non-Jew. Ki am kadosh atah l'Hashem lokecha, because you are a holy nation to God. Lo tevashel gdi b'chalev imo. Don't cook the goat the kid in its mother's milk. Okay, so what does he say? Because they're said in the same pasuk, et shasur mishum nevela, asur l'vashel b'chalav. It's forbidden because of nevela, then you can't eat it with milk. Of shasur mishum nevela. Okay, so this means anything that can't be just killed. Like this excludes fish, for example. Okay, which obviously anyway isn't included here. Okay, there's no fish prohibition here. But I think I've accidents. Did I say fish before? Anyway, I meant, right, meat. We said behema, chaya, and oaf. That's what the first Mishnah had said. If I added fish by accident, it was only by accident that I said that. Anyway, okay, so now they're going to say the following. If all things that can become nevela are part of this prohibition, which would then include chayot also, right? Not just behemot, also chayot, because chayot you can't eat if they're a nevela, if they die on their own. But oaf, you would have thought also, you can't eat a nevela of an oaf, it has to be slaughtered. You might have thought it's prohibited by Torah law. Because it says in its mother's milk, there is no milk for for chickens. So they don't drink their mother's milk, and therefore they're not part of this prohibition. Now the Gemara asks, where do we get this from? Okay, what we're asking here is, where do we get it from? That it's all kinds of meat and not just a gdi. Okay, everyone was in agreement. Let's just clarify. According to Rabbi Akiva, chickens and undomesticated animals are not by Torah law. According to Rabbi Yossi HaGlili, only chickens aren't. And according to the rabbis, the mainstream position, all 3 are forbidden. But everybody agrees that it's not just a gdi, it's all animals. So where do we get that from? Okay, Yehuda sends to the gdi ha'izim. This is in the story with Tamar. So what do they learn from here? Turning now to Amud Bet. Kan gdi izim, ha kol makom shne'amar gdi izim. Kol makom shne'amar gdi stam afilu parav rachel b'mashma. It specifically in the Yehuda story said gdi ha'izim, a gdi of the izim, of the goats. But this comes to teach that anywhere it says gdi without the modifier ha'izim, afilu parav rachel b'mashma. This includes other animals as well, including cows and any kind of other sheep. So then they say, v'leilaf minei. What do you mean? Why don't we learn? Because it says there gdi ha'izim, maybe it means every time it says gdi, it means the gdi of the izim. And it's only goat family and nothing else. Say, that's because k'tiv krach harina. Because in another pasuk it says ve'et oro gdiye ha'izim, and that's in the my mind is blanking for one quick second. The gdiye et oro gdiye ha'izim hobisha al yadav. Right. This is with Yaakov. Rachel puts on Yaakov the fur, right, to make him look like he's hairy, like Esav. Okay, so from the hairs of the gdi ha'izim. So because it says there again gdi ha'izim, they say kan gdi ha'izim ha kol makom shne'amar gdi stam afilu parav rachel b'mashma. The fact that it appears a second time, we then use that one as a proof. And the first time, maybe you could say this builds the paradigm for every time it says gdi, it must be only izim. But the second time, it says, oh no, anytime it says gdi, it really means everything else. And just when it says gdi izim, it means specifically from the goat family. So now they say, v'leilaf minei. What do you mean? Maybe both times it's setting a paradigm, to which we might remember this principle. We've had it many times. Havalu shnei ktuvim habaim ke'echad. This is two psukim that are teaching the same thing. Both say Gdi ha'izim, Gdi ha'izim. So whenever we have two telling you the same thing, we don't build a paradigm out of it. Anything that appears twice, right? How do we build a paradigm? If it says it once, that's the paradigm. If it says it twice, it means, the Torah went out of its way to say it twice to tell you only in these two places, nowhere else. Well, there's a bit of a machloket about that. You might remember, that's if you say that two don't teach. But some people think 2 times actually could still build a paradigm, and only if it appears 3 times can we not build a paradigm. So, what are you going to say for those who hold 2 actually teaches the paradigm, and where are you going to learn the Parah and Rachel from? That they're also forbidden to cook in milk, even though it said only the goat. Izim ha'izim, because in both places it says ha'izim. It doesn't just say izim, gedi of goats. It says gedi of the goats, and that is very specific, and therefore it means specifically in these 2 cases and not anywhere else. Amar Shmuel. Now we're going to darshan, the fact that this appears 3 times, another way, and you're going to see this whole story is very surprising because we're so, at least I was brought up on, right? 3 times lo tfashel gdi b'chalev imo appears in the Torah. 3 times. 1, again, don't cook, don't eat, and it's forbidden to benefit from. But we're going to have different drashot about this. So Shmuel is actually going to darshan 3 times. He's actually going to darshan is 6, and the Gemara is going to get saying, where'd you get 6 from? Okay? But he's going to have 6 drashot here. Gdi lirabot tachelev. By the way, I told you we're going to have a lot of 3s. So this is another 3-sim in our daf of the 3 times that it appears. We have the drasha of Rabbi Akiva of the 3. We have, again, here the 3. So, Gdi l'rabot chalev. Also, chalev, the forbidden fats, if you cook them in milk, it's forbidden for basar b'chalev reasons. It's also like milk and meat, even though it's just the fat and not the meat, but it's also forbidden. Gdi, the second time it appears, l'rabot hameta, if it dies on its own. Meaning, right, if it died and it's a nevela, it's still forbidden if you cook it in its milk, in milk. Gdi l'rabot tashlil. Gdi also comes to teach you that if you have a fetus, then it's also going to be forbidden to cook in milk. Gdi, okay, now, those were 3 that came to include 3 cases. Now we're going to say, Gdi also appears 3 times to exclude. Gdi lahotzi et hadam, to say the Gdi, but not the goat, but not its blood. If you cook the blood in milk, there's no prohibition. I mean, obviously there's prohibition because of blood, but there's no prohibition of blood mixed with milk. Gdi lahotzi et tashiliyah. If you cook the placenta, also no problem, because that's not the Gdi. Gdi lahotzi et hatme'ah, also not a non-kosher. Now, if you remember, Rabbi Akiva learned the non-kosher from also one of the times it's mentioned, so this is actually an overlap. B'chalev imo, now we're going to darshan. So the Gdi appeared 3 times, so we darshaned it actually as 6, and we're going to get back and say it only says a 3, how do you get 6? But we'll get back to that soon. But the drasha continues of Shmuel, b'chalev imo, which also appears 3 times. V'lo b'chalev zachar, if a male for some reason ended up with milk in its udders, or it doesn't, right? So I don't know how you would have this, but if it was milk that came from a male, it would be not forbidden to cook it in the meat. B'chalev imo v'lo b'chalev shchuta, okay, and the chalev of its mother, but not chalav, milk that appears in an animal that was slaughtered. If, let's say, an animal drank milk and the milk was in its stomach, so that's not forbidden to cook with meat because it has to come from the mother. B'chalev imo, and milk that was meant for nursing, right, for giving to its offspring, not milk that it drank. B'chalev imo v'lo b'chalev tme'ah. Okay, the 3rd time is saying, right, and not from non-kosher milk, which we saw before, right? That's also not non-kosher meat and also not non-kosher milk. So the Gemara now asks the question that we asked, which is, Hatzalata Gdi Ktive, how do you have 6 drashot from Gdi? Right? Va'anan Shitan Darshin, and you darshan 6, and it only said 3 times. So they say, we're going to take these 6 and squeeze them into 3. Okay, how so? Well, Kasever Shmuel Isur Chala Isur. Shmuel held that Isur Chala Isur. You could have 2 prohibitions, like Chalev, which is forbidden, and then mix it with Chalav. That's another prohibition. That would be, right, we've learned many times, where there's this machloket, but in general, we say Ein Isur Chala Isur. You can't have one prohibition go on top of another, unless there's certain criteria and things that go on. So we'll get to that. So what does he say? Well, both in the chaylev case and in the nevela case, those are two cases. The nevela is forbidden because it's a nevela if the animal died. So, and then if you mix it with milk, that's adding another prohibition. So isur chaylev umeita mechad kranafke. Well, we're going to squeeze those down into one. Basically, he holds that isur is halal isur in general, or you would have thought so. Come these two drashot to teach you, which really ends up being one drasha, one concept, which is isur is chal al isur here. Okay, and because of that, we're going to say, so isur chal isur, and that you can get to chaylev is forbidden to mix to cook with milk, and also if it dies on its own, it's a nevela. Because once you learn here isur chal isur in general as a principle, we can then say, right. So he's going to say isur is chal al isur, and we're learning it from this pasuk, but we only need one drasha and not two. So that goes down to 5 because we take one out. Dam nami lav gdihu. Okay, blood, you don't even need a drasha for. It's not even a goat. It's just the blood. Vishilya nami pirsha ba'almahu. And the shilya, the placenta, is just like it's like a waste, a form of waste or something. So it's nothing. It's just something that comes out of the animal. So pashalut trace. So we got rid of those two, and now we're down to 3. Chad rabot tashlil, chad beute behemat be'ah. And then we're left with, right, the one we had before, and the one, right, which is the combo of isur chal isur, and to include the shlil, the fetus, and to include the non-kosher, to exclude the non-kosher animal. And that's how in the end we took these 6 and we whittled them down to 3. Now they're going to ask, wait a minute, that was all based on that Shmuel holds the isur chal isur, which is basically darshaned out from this pasuk, okay? Because that's what he's saying. One of the times is coming to say that isur chal isur, you could have something that's forbidden because of chaylev, and then you cook it with milk, it's now going to have 2 prohibitions on it. 1, it's chaylev, 2, it's mixed with milk, or nevela, and then cooked with milk. For Savar Shmuel, isur chal isur, wait, does Shmuel hold the isur chal isur? Because we just said, he takes one of the mentions of this to say that isur chal isur, if you eat chaylev, and then you also happen to cook it, right? You ate chaylev that you also cooked with milk, you're going to violate 2 prohibitions, same with nevela. And he gets it from this pasuk. So now we're going to have to say that Shmuel holds the isur chal isur. That's what we explained. But Shmuel somewhere else doesn't say this. V'hamar Shmuel mishum Rabbi Eliezer, it says Rabbi Elazar, it should be Rabbi Eliezer, minayin lekohen tameh shachal trumat me'ah she'ino b'mita. How do you know that a kohen who's impure, who eats truma that's impure, doesn't get the death penalty? Here there's 2 prohibitions. Okay, first of all, a kohen who's impure and eats truma, which is good truma, gets the death penalty. Okay, and that's because the pasuk says, which we're going to read right now, Shneimar umetu bo ki chalaluhu. He's going to die because he desecrated the truma by eating it when he was in an impure state. But if the truma itself is in an impure state, where there's 2 prohibitions, a kohen can't eat truma that's in an impure state, but a kohen also who's impure can't eat truma. So there's 2 prohibitions there. So now what do we say? Well, because it says umetu bo ki chalu prat lezo shemechulel va'omedet. So this one is already desecrated, so it's excluded. And that would be because it seems like ein isur chal isur. It's already prohibited, or we're not going to have another prohibition. Kohen who eats truma, but if the kohen is already, right, a kohen who's impure who eats truma, but if the truma is already disqualified, then he's not going to be obligated. He's not going to get the death penalty for doing that because ein isur chal isur. It was already prohibited because the kohen was tamei. Now that the truma became tamei, we're not going to add another prohibition. So now the Gemara is going to say, so that seems like Shmuel holds ein isur chal isur, to which we have a bunch of answers. Maybe that's a special drasha just there in the truma case because it says umetu bo, it's going to die by this and not anything else, and therefore in that case there's no prohibition on top of another prohibition. But in every other case, yes. Or now, before I told you that we assumed that he got isur chal isur from this pasuk, but now we're going to say no. Maybe because by the extra mention of Gedi teaches you isur chal isur in this particular case, but maybe not anywhere else. And then the truma tmeah case is just in addition to, right, is part of the regular cases. And the third option is Hadide, Hadirabe. One is his own opinion, one was he quoted Rabbi Eliezer. Remember, it was introduced as he quoted Rabbi Eliezer. So he quoted someone who said, Ein isur chal isur, but he himself thinks isur is halal isur. You could have 2 prohibitions, one on top of the other. Ba'amine Rav Achtavoy bar Ami Mevrav. Hamavashel b'chalev gdi shelo hinika mahu. What if you cooked in the milk of a gdi that hasn't yet nursed? Okay, so is that chalav aim because she's never nursed before? So Amarle mid itzrich l'shmuel l'meimer b'chalev imo v'lo b'chalev zacharu delo ate l'chlal aim aval hai kevan deba l'chlal aim asu. Because Shmuel needed to say b'chalav aim, and his drasha was chalav aim and not chalav zachar, he had to exclude the zachar, the male. They say, only a zachar is excluded, but any female is not excluded, even if she's never nursed before. Itmar. Now we're going to start a big machloket that's going to have 4 different explanations of it. We're only going to start it today. We'll finish in the next daf. Itmar. Mefashel chelav b'chalav. What if you cooked chelav with chalav, which we already said is forbidden, because isur chal isur, that was Shmuel. Well, we're going to see maybe not everyone agrees. We're going to have to see. Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi. Chadamar loket, chadamar no loket. One says it's prohibited and you get lashes for it. That sounds like Shmuel. And one says you don't get lashes. So now, lema b'hakami palge. Let's assume this is the machloket. Demand amar loket kasavar isur chal isur. The one who says you get lashes holds like Shmuel. You can have one prohibition on top of another. The one who says you don't get lashes is because you don't have one prohibition on another. So you're not going to get lashes. You're going to get lashes for eating chaylev. You're not going to get lashes for eating chaylev with milk. Well, then the Gemara suggests, maybe not. Lo, de kule alma eni sor chal isur. Maybe everybody agrees that eni sor chal isur. There is no prohibition on another. Nobody agrees with Shmuel. But achila kule alma lo pligi de lo lake. Everyone agrees when it comes to eating it, you're not going to get lashes because there's no it's already prohibited because of chaylev. You're not going to have an added prohibition about the milk. Ki pligi abishul. But their machloket is about cooking because there's no prohibition to cook chaylev. So manda amar lokeh, the one who says you get lashes chadi suru. It's only one prohibition, which is the chaylev cooking with the milk. That's the problem. Umanda amar no lokeh lahachi afkar achmana laachila b'lashon bishul. The one who says you don't get lashes, that's because he says, why the Torah say, lo tivashel gdi, when it really meant don't eat, because kema da alachila lo lake, abishul nami lo lake. Because if you're not going to get lashes on eating, then you're also not going to get the lashes on cooking. So even though the cooking only really has one prohibition, and you should get lashes for the milk, for the chaylev with the milk, but because you're not going to get lashes for eating it, because ani sor chal isur, because you don't have one prohibition going on another, you're also not going to get lashes for the cooking, and that's because it used the language bishul when it really meant eating, and therefore bishul and eating have the same law. Okay, we're going to stop here, but we're going to have 2 other ways to possibly explain their machloket. Okay, so we did the review of the first part of the daf, then we went into this the Mishnah that we weren't sure if it held like Rabbi Akiva or didn't hold like Rabbi Akiva about putting chicken on the table with the cheese. Then we went into the machloket between Rabbi Yossi Aglili, Rabbi Akiva, and the rabbis about which things are included in this prohibition. Just meat of behemot, also chayot, or also afot, and different combinations. We'll get back to Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yossi Aglili's machloket later, not in today's stuff. Then we got to this pasuk about the Gedi Ayizim. How do we know that all behemot, at least everyone agreed, are included? And that was because of the Gedi Ayizim came to exclude, but any other time it says Gedi, it just means all animals. And then we got to Shmuel, who had these 6 drashot, which we whittled down to 3 on the Gedi, and then 3 drashot on the Chalev Imo, which things are included, which things are excluded in this prohibition. And then we said, well, it seems like Shmuel holds Isser Chal Isser, but how could that be? Doesn't he hold that? And we had 3 answers to that question. Again, there were a lot of 3s today. And then we ended with this, with number 1 about a mother who's never nursed. Actually, hers is still prohibited. That was from the Sadr Drasha about not the Zachar. And we ended with this Mefashel Chelav B'Chalav, which we're going to get back to in the next stuff, so we'll review it then. And with that, wishing everyone a good day and a Shabbat Shalom.